The views and opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily those of this station, JVC Broadcasting Management, or its sponsors.
Welcome to Crime and Justice Radio, where we talk crime, justice, mayhem in the courts with legal experts and with expert insiders and sometimes legal outcasts. My name is Aida Leisenring. Hello, Bruce.
Hello, Aida. How are you tonight?
I am well. Bruce Barket, how are you feeling this Monday?
You know what? I'm feeling great, and I'll tell you why I'm feeling great tonight. I'm the luckiest guy on the planet because there's really one thing in this world that I'm competent at, which is practicing law, and I get to do that, and people pay me to do that, and I earn a nice living for it, and now I get to come on the radio and talk about it with you and others. So life is good. You know what we do? My favorite phrase is we represent the accused. We defend those that the police have arrested. We beg for mercy for the convicted, and we participate in the exoneration of the innocent. One of those innocent people that we participated in the exoneration of stopped by to see us today, Marty Tankleff.
Marty Tankleff, after nagging me repeatedly about whether or not I had a copy of the Law Journal, where he is featured as now representing one of the Capitol rioters.
A great success for Marty. He was. I remember the day he got out of prison. That was in 2007, and here we are. Some 14 years later, he's a lawyer practicing law, helping other individuals charged with crimes.
And he's helped exonerate other people.
Yes.
And that's incredible.
And he's a professor at Georgetown University. So He's really doing great things. And the other reason I'm happy this week is I get to brag a little bit.
Oh, here we go.
Not a big brag.
Here we go.
Not a big brag. It was not a hard call, but it was a call I made correctly, which was Chauvin. Last week we were here. I said we'd have a guilty verdict on all counts quickly. And it actually stunned me that we got a verdict back as quickly as they came, but I told you so. It was a horrible defense. The guy never had a chance, and he got convicted of everything very quickly.
Excuse me, Bruce. I said we'd have a verdict in 2 days. They deliberated on Monday, and they deliberated on Tuesday. After 8 hours, they came back with a verdict, so I don't think I told you so is in order.
It is a little bit. You predicted, if I recall correctly, a hung jury on the top count.
Well, I had to make it different.
It did. Like I said, it wasn't a hard call, but it was a call that we made correctly. And unfortunately, I think in some ways it's sad. Perhaps it was the right verdict, but I never feel good about seeing somebody get convicted like that, seeing someone handcuffed and escorted out of the courtroom. Thankfully, it hasn't happened to us all that often, but it always makes me a little sad to see it.
For me, it was seeing a picture of him, and he had something written on the inside of his hand, and it turned out to be his lawyer's telephone number. And it made me sad for a second because of the times that we stand by our clients and a verdict is coming in and we don't know if they're going to get convicted. And the ones that are out, as soon as they're convicted, they often get remanded immediately, and they're remanded without their belongings and without, their cell phone contacts. So he knew that was the most important number. And speaking of seeking mercy, because sometimes we do get to participate in the exoneration of the innocents and we defend the accused, but seeking mercy is something that we do almost more than anything else. And that's going to be critical. And I'm so curious about how that's going to work out, what kind of sentence Derek Chauvin is going to get, and what we don't know about him that we'll soon learn.
Well, I'll tell you what kind of sentence he's going to get. He's going to spend the rest of his life in prison. That's what kind of sentence he's going to get.
I'm not sure about that, and here's why. I was stunned, pleasantly surprised that Ellison, one of the lead prosecutors in the case, during a 60 Minutes interview, indicated that he wasn't seeking a lengthier prison sentence than the average similarly situated defendant, and that would be about 12 years. Ellison said the verdict was just, but that he felt a little bad for the defendant. He said he's a human being. Ellison himself has practiced criminal defense for 16 years and has been in the same shoes as the defense lawyer watching his client go in. And when the prosecutor isn't seeking a significant sentence, the judge ought not sentence that individual to more time.
Watch what happens. The same pressure that was applied to the jury to convict him, and as I said, maybe rightly so, is going to be applied to this judge to throw the book at Mr. Chauvin, and he will get every day in prison that the law allows, which I believe the maximum is 40 years. But we'll see in a couple of months. Make a note of this, save the tape, as they say, and maybe in 2 months you'll get to say, I told you so to me. We'll see.
We'll see.
Hey, we have a great show that we didn't introduce yet. We have Ron McAndrew coming up in a few minutes, who is a retired warden on death row in Florida, to discuss his personal participation in executions, what that did to him, his own being, how it changed him, and how it changed his views on the death penalty. Fascinating conversation. But before we get to that, I want to chat a little bit about a recent Supreme Court decision, which was
a terrible one.
It was terrible. It was absolutely terrible. Jones v. Mississippi. It was just decided about a week ago or so. And what it did is it largely reversed two other cases, Miller v. Alabama and Montgomery versus Louisiana. Both of those cases stood for the proposition that a lifetime in prison is a disproportionate sentence for all but the rarest children whose crimes reflect irreparable corruption. And I say children, they mean teenagers under the age of 18. And courts had been making special findings as to whether the teenager was incorrigible, which is the word the court used, to justify sentencing individual to life without parole. And Mr. Jones, I say Mr. Jones now because he is in his 20s, killed his grandfather just 23 days after Mr. Jones turned 15 years old. And he was sentenced to life without parole. In short, he was the victim of violence throughout his life. He got into an argument with his grandfather over his girlfriend or something and ended up stabbing him and immediately regretted it. But the court affirmed that sentence, saying that they don't have to do hearings in order to justify keeping the person in prison for life. Understand what we're saying. We're saying life without the possibility of parole at 15.
And from what I understand, there was a tremendous amount of mitigation of that 15-year-old. Obviously, we don't support anyone killing anyone, right? But he didn't get to that position all by himself. It
might have been a manslaughter under New York law. It doesn't sound like it was premeditated. It might not even been intentional.
He had been physically abused. He had, I think his biological father was an alcoholic who also physically abused his mom. He grew up being beaten with belts, switches, and a paddle labeled the Punisher. And so this 15-year-old who made a terrible decision and really didn't have the opportunities that the average individual has will now spend the rest of his life in prison. And when he's 50 years old, is he that same 15-year-old boy?
No, he's not even the same 15-year-old boy now. From all accounts, he's done great in prison, to the extent that somebody can do great in prison. He got his GED, and he's earned the respect of prison guards and fellow prisoners alike. He has an exemplary record and has clearly began to rehabilitate himself. And it's not as if we're saying he should get out or that the dissent, this was a 6-3 decision right along Republican-Democratic lines. The 6 conservative justices, this decision was written by Kavanaugh, by the way, who himself as a teenager may not have behaved so well, but seems to have worked his life out okay. Those 6 Republicans voted to keep this boy in jail for life without the possibility of parole, and the 3 more liberal judges voted to give him the possibility of parole. Not the certainty of release, but the opportunity at some point in their lives to show a parole board that they have what they have done to rehabilitate themselves.
And by the way, I looked this up because I was so curious to see how, who's the youngest kid in prison. There are 6-year-olds apparently somewhere out there
That's
right now.
insane.
I know that's absolutely insane, but there's more than I think approximately 50,000 kids are in jail. A fraction of them are in an adult prison. And what do you think happens to young kids that go to adult prisons?
Nothing good.
Nothing good.
So we'll be back in a minute to chat about some criminal justice reform issues, including mandatory minimums.
Crime and Justice Radio is brought to you by the law firm of Barket, Epstein, Kieran, Aida, and Laturco, defending individuals accused of state and federal crimes, prosecuting the government for violations of your civil rights, fighting to overturn wrongful convictions, and seeking to make you whole if you've been injured in an accident. You can find them at www.barketepstein.com or call 516-745-1500. Barket Epstein meets all your litigation needs from the Hudson to the Hamptons.
Welcome back. Crime and Justice Radio with Aida Leisenring and myself. I'm Bruce Barket. We are two lawyers, criminal defense lawyers, and two of several partners at a firm, Barket, Epstein, Aida, Kieran, and Laturco. God forbid I forget somebody's name. Let's talk a little bit about mandatory minimums and some other criminal justice reform issues if we can.
I'm against them. How's that? Every time I have a client that's subjected to a mandatory minimum, and it can be like a perfectly good person that made a poor choice, didn't anticipate what was going to happen. And I say to them, if we go to trial and you lose and there's a guilty verdict against you, and the judge has seen how you've behaved throughout the entirety of the case, say 2 years of coming back and forth to court, and knows that you're an incredibly good person, that you've volunteered, that you've raised good kids, and disagrees with the verdict of the jury, he, at best, still has to sentence you to a minimum of, say, 5 years. He can still do a maximum of 25 years, but 5 years. And it's just wrong because one size doesn't fit all.
And well, the thing that people may not realize is not just for murder. Mandatory minimums apply to a host of crimes, virtually all felonies. If you've been convicted of a felony previously in New York and you get convicted of another one, there's a mandatory minimum for you. In federal proceedings, for drug sales, and not drug traffickers, international narcotic traffickers, just some guy in a corner who is selling cocaine or heroin. Mandatory minimum, 5 years, 10 years happens real fast. And you and I have experienced this where we know of one case where a judge certainly would have given this individual much less than the mandatory minimum of 10 years, but was left with no choice whatsoever. And this is exactly where Jones v. Mississippi left off. What they did is, all Jones did is say it's discretionary to the court. The court can give a juvenile, somebody under 18, less than life without parole, but can give them life without parole. Mandatory minimums takes that away from the judge and literally says what you just said, one size fits all. It's one of the issues that I think that the Biden administration and hopefully the new Congress will, in fact, address. Another issue that comes up is no-knock warrants.
So what's the justification of a no-knock warrant, and what it is, just for listeners, and the name might sound obvious, is that police get authorization from a judge to basically bust into an apartment and not announce that they're coming in. So you could be, like Breonna Taylor, sleeping at home, not realizing that police were coming in through the door. What justifies no-knock warrants, Bruce?
What justifies them? And when I was a prosecutor in another life, I obtained these kinds of warrants. And they're almost there for the asking. What you have to do is make a showing that if you don't have a no-knock warrant, in other words, if the police aren't allowed to simply bust down the door and run into the house, that evidence may be destroyed or the officer's safety may be in jeopardy. It is not as high a standard as people think. They're issued far too often. I don't think they should be eliminated at all, but I think the standard ought to be real and it ought to be scrutinized by the judges issuing these warrants. And the reason why we bring that up is you have Breonna Taylor, who was shot to death in the course of an execution of a no-knock warrant. And as we know, they were at the wrong house. And this is why no-knock warrants can be a problem. It's one of the other issues for criminal justice reform that we hope the Biden administration takes up. And the top of my list for the Biden administration is the death penalty. He promised to abolish the federal death penalty, and he's done nothing with it so far. There are 3 places where he can. Individuals who are eligible for execution decide whether or not they should be executed. In other words, if the government should seek execution. They have individuals who the government has already said they want to seek the death penalty against, but their trials haven't happened. And there are people that are sentenced to death waiting for execution.
And that's 47 people right now.
Federal death row.
On federal death row across the states, which obviously Biden can't do anything about. There are over 2,500 individuals that are on death row.
Think about that. In the United States,
we're waiting to kill 2,500 people.
Well, this brings us right to our guest, Ron McAndrew, who is now a prison consultant, but started off his career in the Air Force, was in corporate America for a while, and he ended up becoming a warden on Florida's death row. Is Ron on the phone for us? Ron, how are you?
Okay, thanks.
And sorry, Bruce said corporate America, but you were actually a man living a life of culture in Europe, working for one of the biggest luxury brand French companies in the world.
That's corporate America.
They just eat better.
Corporate France.
Corporate France.
So tell us, how did you end up going from eating well in France to executing people in Florida?
Well, when the war ended in Vietnam, our business took a nosedive, and I lost my job with the European firm. I wound up in Hawaii, and then came back to the mainland USA looking for a job in Florida. I couldn't find a job in Miami. Nobody needed a French perfume salesman. So someone recommended to me, they said, Ron, go down to the prison. I hear they're desperate for help.
What was your reaction?
I was repulsed at first. I said, are you kidding? But within a few days, I realized that my bank account was going down quickly. I had my son in high school back in France. I had child support and alimony. I needed health insurance, which I didn't have at the time. So I said, well, maybe I'll just try this prison thing, and if it, until I find a real job. But within a couple of months, I realized I'd found my niche.
I mean, you say you found your niche. You rose up pretty fast in the ranks there. How did you do that?
A couple of things. One, I realized it was very important to know the policies better than the people that supervise me. And so I studied, and I participated in a lot of the outside activities, such as the American Correctional Association, Florida Council on Crime and Delinquency. And through these organizations, I met important people that realized I had some form of a talent, administrative talent, you might say, and that helped a lot.
Well, when you first started working in the correctional facilities, had you ever had any experience with inmates at all? Like, were you physically present in the dorms, in the cells? What was that like after flying first class in Pan Am airline and, wining and dining in France? What was that experience to you?
Well, my only experience with prisons prior to this was when I was in the Air Force. We had a fellow Air Force airman that was in a prison, a French prison, and the embassy would send out like a care package for him once a month. It had little goodies in it, socks and underwear and candy bars. So I had to deliver that to the front gate. And a fellow opened the gate, took the box out of my hands, and that was my only experience with prison.
How did you get along with the inmates initially?
Well, that was the inmates helped me get promoted more than anyone else.
How's that?
I learned very quickly, as I had learned in private business, that if you treat people just a little bit as you would like to be treated yourself, you're going to get a whole lot of cooperation. And it worked.
That is not, Aida and I spent a good amount of our time visiting prisons, and I dare say that is not, I don't think, the prevailing view among the guards that we have interacted with.
Yeah, well, a lot of the correctional officers resented the fact that I treated inmates as human beings, but post-haste they were working under my supervision, so that went away quickly.
Hey, Ron, we want you to stick around through the break because the next segment we want you to describe for us and for our listeners what it's like to personally participate in executions and how your participation changed you and changed your view on the death penalty. Stick around, everybody. We'll be back in just a minute.
Welcome back to Crime and Justice Radio. This is Aida Leisenring. I'm here with Bruce Barket, and we have an incredible guest, Ron McAndrew, former warden of Florida Correctional Department. He is going to tell a story about literally executing 3 men on death row and how that changed his views on the death penalty. Ron, welcome back. Thank you for being here. I've been anti-death penalty my whole life, but I'm good friends and have family members that are pro-death penalty. And what I think a lot of people don't realize is somebody else has to actually do the job. So I want to ask you, what goes into that, and what was that experience like for you?
Well, I walked right into adulthood supporting the death penalty. It was distant. It was not in my backyard. And you would hear these horrible stories about the crimes. So as a Southern boy growing up in North Carolina with a family that had an Old Testament and a New Testament, I naturally supported an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So many, many years later, when I was advised that I was being reassigned to Florida State Prison, I was asked if I would have any problems carrying out executions. And my answer was instant. No, sir. No problems here. I support the death penalty entirely. And I did, until I got up close to it.
And when was the first time you got up close to it? And I hate to ask it this way, but it's not like you just wake up one day, go into a room and follow instructions and kill someone. There's preparation involved that actually gets you to know that individual. Is that right?
It is, very much so.
Can you describe that experience?
Well, the first execution I carried out at Florida State Prison was John Earl Bush. And I think I advised him that I had a death warrant. In fact, I read the death warrant to him about 25 days prior to his execution. And during that 25 days, I had segregated him from another area far apart from the death row inmates. I got to know him. I got to know his family, his attorney, his friends, and I got to know a few of his enemies as well. But he went from being a prison number to a human being. And when the final day came that I had to sit down on a cot next to him and tell him we're getting ready to shave your head and your right leg, and I'm supposed to read this death penalty to you again, but let's just consider it read. And he shook his head, and he had become very strong in his faith at the time, and he was praying under his breath. And it took on a whole new meaning for me. He wasn't just a number. He was somebody. He had a mother just like me. He had a father. He had a victim. He had some victims. But just the same. Many years had passed since this had happened, and no one in the world knew what had happened to John Earl Bush during those years. You know, had he become a better person? Had he found redemption?
Had he found redemption? Had he become a better person?
I believe so, yes.
So tell us one thing you said. You shaved his head and his leg. Why is that?
Well, you don't want to burn the hair. This is where the electrodes are connected.
So he was electrocuted.
Yes, he was.
And what was your role in that?
Well, I have an officer that I instructed to shave his head and his leg. Of course, I went in to soften him up and to get his cooperation so we didn't have to restrain him. And he was very cooperative. He was very nice to everybody. He was almost apologetic for putting everybody out of their way.
Were you nervous?
Was he nervous?
No, were you nervous?
Yes, of course I was nervous. I'm getting ready to kill a fellow human being.
And did he have friends on death row, or was he isolated during the time that he was incarcerated?
No, he was on death row for many years, and he had a lot of friends there. In fact, when I went down to the cell to take him out of the cell and move him downstairs for death watch, that's where an officer sits and watches him around the clock. He can't even go to the bathroom without being watched during that period. And you can't cheat the governor out of his execution because you can't allow a death row inmate to commit suicide.
What was it like for his friends and other inmates that got to know him over the course of the years?
Well, there was a lot of correspondence I received from inmates on death row asking if I would pass a message to his mother or his father. Would I make it known that he was a good and decent person on death row, that he had been very helpful to other inmates, helping them get through their own issues and problems. And like I say, this number turned into a human being.
That was your first execution. I want to ask you about what I believe was your last, which was...
But before we go in there, I'm sorry to interrupt,
That's
Bruce.
Okay.
How is it? So we see it in the movies, right? And in the movies, it is a curtain. It comes up. There's a couple people surrounding the individual. He maybe has his last words. There are some witnesses, and then that's that. What's actually going on behind the curtain?
Well, the curtain is closed so that no one sees the condemned being strapped to the electric chair. You anticipate resistance, and in this case, there was none. You attach all the electrodes. You attach the copper helmet over the top of the head. Of course, there's a natural sponge that's filled with a saline solution that goes on top of the head, and then the copper helmet. And there's a leather mask that goes over the face after he has been given the opportunity to give his last words. And at that point, the curtain is raised, and the 26 witnesses they have in Florida, 9 civilians and 9 media, they're able to see and hear his last words.
Is there any pain felt by the person? You mentioned that all sorts of electrodes are strapped onto him. I assume tape is also strapped on the individual, and then the mask. Does any of that cause any pain to the person?
He is strapped so tightly to the chair. It's an oak chair that was actually built by an inmate many years ago. From a tree that grew on the property. In fact, the inmate picked out the tree and said, "You cut that tree and give me this section of wood, and I'll make you this electric chair." Because there can't be any metal. It has to be all wood.
Wow.
And
so that was your first, and I think your last, tell me if I'm wrong, was Pedro Luis Medina. Is that right?
It was my last in Florida. I went to Texas, and I worked 5 lethal injections down there, learning that new process, and to bring that knowledge back to Florida, because it was obvious after the Pedro Medina execution that we were going to move away from the electric chair and into lethal injection.
Why was that obvious? What happened during that execution?
The amount of water that was the saline solution that should have been left in the sponge was not left in the sponge. The sponge was squeezed too tightly, and as a result, there was not enough condensation in the sponge to allow the electric to go over the head or down into the head without creating a fire. And needless to say, when I gave the executioner the secret signal to apply the electricity, there was a sudden electrical pop, as if you had turned on a switch and it popped in front of you. And then there was a plume of smoke, and then flame came right up in front of my face. And the electrician that was standing behind him had on these big, what they call power line gloves that will handle that kind of electricity. And he asked me, continue, with a question mark behind it. There was no way we could back off at that point. We had to literally sit there and burn this man to death.
Could you tell whether or not he was experiencing pain?
The tightness of the body when the electric hits it. The hands squeeze the end of the arms of the electric chair so tightly that you'd think he could actually crush the yoke. The chest heaves. The face swells. The legs, you can see the muscles in the legs tighten. There's obviously something going on in that person's body causing this reaction. I don't have the full answer for that, but I can tell you, in my opinion, and this is a personal opinion, yes, I do believe those that are executed both by electricity and by lethal injection suffer a lot of physical pain.
Ron, we want to come right back. We have another very short break, about 30 seconds. We're going to come right back. And we want to talk to you about how performing these executions affected you personally, and how it ultimately changed your views on the death penalty itself. Very, very gripping account you just gave. Thank you.
Crime and Justice Radio is brought to you by the law firm of Barket, Epstein, Kieran, Aida, and Loturco, defending individuals accused of state and federal crimes, prosecuting the government for violations of your civil rights, fighting to overturn wrongful convictions, and seeking to make you whole if you've been injured in an accident. You can find them at www.barketepstein.com or call 516-745-1500. Barket Epstein meets all your litigation needs from the Hudson to the Hamptons.
Welcome back to Crime and Justice Radio. I'm Aida Leisenring. I'm here with Bruce Barket, and we're speaking with Ron McAndrew, retired warden from Florida, who executed 3 men by the electric chair and presided over 5, or actually executed 5 others through lethal injections. Ron, thank you so much for sharing this with us. Something I certainly can't talk about with people in my profession because you're so uniquely situated. At what point, or did there come a point that you said, enough, I can't do this anymore?
Yes, there did.
Tell us about that.
Well, after I returned from my 3rd trip to Texas and my 5th lethal injection, and seeing a different form of killing people in Texas, I had to take a really serious look at myself. I knew I was having a problem, and my wife certainly knew it because she watched me drink half a bottle of whiskey every night. And she knew that I was troubled, and she kept encouraging me to get some help, but I was too big of a guy to do that at the time.
And did you get visited by these individuals? Did you see them in your dreams?
It was almost real. These men came and sat on the edge of my bed at night. It was so real, I would actually move over and make room for them. It was almost like I could smell them.
Wow.
Because there is an odor when you're executing people.
The electrocutions, I'm sure, even with the lethal injections, it was still a whole experience for you to actually be there when somebody was being killed.
Yeah, applying the IVs, there have to be 2 IVs in case there's a blowout. You have a second option for administering the chemicals to the body. And
well, let me stop you. What's a blowout?
a blowout is when you have it's not like your average IV that you would get when you go for day surgery or something and they put an IV in your arm or the back of your hand. This is where they put it in the pit of your arm, and they have to have it truly deeply inserted. And when it's inserted, it's taped down with industrial high-strength tape. And then that tape is covered up with white hospital tape.
Why is that?
Make it look clean and...
antiseptic.
Yeah, antiseptic. A lot of things are done before the curtains are open.
How have you recovered from this? You said that you drank a lot, and now we know what you're doing. You're doing work for prisoners, consulting with law firms, doing other work. But how did you recover from drinking a pint of whiskey or half a bottle of whiskey every night?
My wife, she's a very brave, genius woman. She's also a nurse, and she recognized that my problem was bigger than me, that I needed some help. She called my doctor at the Veterans Administration and told him what I was going through, because she knew I had an appointment coming up. When I got there, Dr. Mark Knapp talked to me about this, and he said, listen, we have a mental health professional that has a similar background. In fact, she used to be the psychologist in another state where a number of her patients were death row inmates that were executed. And it has troubled her.
Wow.
So that was in 2001. And for the next 13, almost 14 years, she became my therapist and my friend. I got a lot out of that therapy, and I still lean on it.
Are you alone here, or are there other former executioners that have become anti-death penalty advocates like yourself?
We have a very large club. We talk to each other. It's not just other wardens that I talk to, but it's members of death teams. One that was on a death team with me that has a similar problem. Started drinking heavily, trying to blacken things out so they could go to sleep. Having the same identical issues and problems that I experienced. So it was real easy for me to tell them, what helped me. Hopefully might help you.
And you describe yourself now as an abolitionist, is that right?
I am indeed.
Which is, you want to...
all over the United States. In fact, I travel all over the world speaking against the death penalty. I lobby against the death penalty in state legislatures around the country.
And if other lawyers or people want to consult with you, they can go to your website at ronmcandrew.com, and you'll be able to consult with them and provide insight into prison life and how to deal with it and how to reduce the sentences potentially, yes?
Yes. I don't take any business outside of Florida anymore because I'm old. I'm 82 years old now, so I don't like to travel as much as I used to, so I have other people that I'm associated with that are handling the business outside of Florida.
Excellent.
What do you say to people that are pro-death penalty and believe that it is appropriate in the worst of the worst cases? If you had an opportunity to shed some light for them, what would you say?
Oh, I always say to them, can you spare me just a few minutes and let me talk to you about this?
Well, look, I wish we had a few more minutes to chat with you. I really do. But I want to thank you for coming on and providing this insight to our listeners. And it's been a pleasure to chat with you both now and when we did earlier in the week. Keep up the good work. I think you're doing God's work. Thanks very much, Ron. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much, Ron. We hope to have you come back again and tell us about other major problems in the prison system one of these days. Hopefully you'll return.
Terrific. Thank you.
Thank you. This brings this show to a far too quick ending. I could have listened to him speak for quite a while. Next week is going to be a unique show because I'm traveling for business.
Business?
A business.
I want to see pictures of all those business meetings that you're going to be having. You're
lawyers.
Abandoning me, but you ought to be scared because I have Stephen Brand, who was born in Brooklyn, raised in Long Island, and is now a criminal defense lawyer in Austin, Texas. He has done, previously he was a prosecutor. He actually was on the prosecution team that prosecuted Tom DeLay, which makes me sound really old for saying that. But he leads a very, very interesting and exciting life. And he helped us out in one of our big cases where he chased material witnesses for us all over Texas. He went to trailer parks. He literally found 6 people that we were trying to target and hauled their butts into court in New York.
So I should be jealous is what you're saying.
You should be.
Well, we'll say I'll be back on the 10th, but I trust Ms. Leisenring and Mr. Brand will provide a great show next week. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you again very soon.
The views and opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily those of this station, JVC Broadcasting Management, or its sponsors. Or its sponsors. Or its sponsors. Or its sponsors. Or its sponsors.